Evening, everybody, and welcome to the Church of Grace. My name is Patrick Hayes. Today is Friday, November 22nd, and we are in the book of Matthew, and we are in Matthew part 48. And we are going to finish up Matthew chapter 22, and we're going to start Matthew chapter 23, and we are definitely not going to get through it. So, the recap is this. Jesus showed up in Jerusalem, we'll call it 2 days ago as far as the Bible timeline goes. And Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey to declare himself as king. The nation of Israel formally rejected Jesus as their Messiah. He went to the temple and he taught. He also had quite an exciting first day. He flipped over the tables of the money changers and those that bought and sold. He made a whole lot of enemies of some of the richest and most powerful and influential people in the city of Jerusalem. And he taught in the temple for the whole day. And right now, filling the city of Jerusalem is really the entire nation of Israel, because this is the week leading up to the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And one of the commandments that we read about back in Deuteronomy, I think it's Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 18, but you're going to have to check and see if my math's right there. One of the commandments that God gave to the nation of Israel is that everyone has to go to Jerusalem 3 times a year, once in the spring, once in the fall, and then once in between for the feast days. So the city of Jerusalem is full. Every able-bodied person in the nation is in Jerusalem. We believe that the population could certainly be upwards of 2 million people in Jerusalem and in the surrounding areas. And after the first day of preaching in the temple, Jesus departs and he goes to Bethany, which was a Sabbath day's journey. It was just up the hill to the Mount of Olives, just past that. And then Jesus came back into town for the second day, and he went to the temple again, and he is preaching in the temple this second day. And the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and they brought another group in for the second day called the Herodians. They are all trying to give Jesus a hard time. They're trying to trip him up. They're trying to get him to be turned on by the crowd, because right now the crowd loves him. And that's making it very difficult for the Pharisees and the Sadducees to continue their corruption. So Jesus is in the temple for the second day, and he's teaching in there. And there are some groups that really don't like him, and we're going to be talking about those groups here tonight. So let's start in chapter 22. I'm going to read 10 verses, 23 through 33, and then we go through it a verse at a time. Now, if you are new to the Church of Grace, a couple things you should know. At any point, raise your hand. If you got a question, if I'm doing a bad job at teaching, just raise your hand, ask a question. It's open to Q&A. I'm going to ask you guys a lot of questions. Some people don't really feel comfortable yelling out an answer. Others do. That's fine. You don't have to. But I do try to, just keep you awake doing that. And also, do not be shy about going up and getting a 5th piece of pie during the middle of the service. That's fine. You can go up and get coffee or pie at any time. You're not going to disturb anyone. So that's kind of the way we do things here. All right, I'm going to read starting in verse 23. The same day came to him the Sadducees, which say that there is no resurrection, and asked him, saying, Master, Moses said, if a man die having no children, his brother shall marry his wife, and raise up seed unto his brother. Now there were with us 7 brethren, and the first, when he had married a wife, deceased, and having no issue, left his wife unto his brother. Now this is a custom in the nation of Israel. So if the oldest brother dies, and the wife, who is now a widow, does not have children, it was customary that the next brother would marry her, so that she and the family could have offspring. So this was not a strange custom. Now it sounds strange to us, but this was normal in the nation of Israel in these days. Verse 26, likewise the second also, and the third, unto the 7th. So these guys have bad luck. Okay, everyone gets married and everyone dies. And last of all, the woman died also. Therefore, in the resurrection, whose wife shall she be of the seven, for they all had her. Verse 29, Jesus answered and said unto them, Ye do err, not knowing the Scriptures, nor the power of God. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels of God in heaven. But as touching the resurrection of the dead, have ye not read that which was spoken unto you by God, saying, I am the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. And when the multitude heard this, they were astonished at his doctrine. All right, so in verse 23, the Sadducees were a competing school of religion and philosophy that started up, I want to say around 300-400 BC. Their rivals were the Pharisees. So, who was in charge during the time of Christ? Pharisees or Sadducees? Who says Pharisees? Raise your hand. Got 3, 4, 5. Who says Sadducees? We got 1, 2. Okay, who's too scared to raise their hand? Got about 20, 25. It's okay. So it was the Sadducees. At the time, the Sadducees were in power. Now, something that you need to remember, when you move through the Gospels into the book of Acts, all of a sudden, the Pharisees are in charge. So there is a power shift, some dynamic where a different group took over. It doesn't give us much in the way of details, but the Sadducees were no longer in charge of the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees were. But at the time of Christ, the Sadducees were the ruling class. So what was the main belief of the Sadducees that set them apart from the Pharisees? They did not believe in the resurrection. Good job, Jesse. They denied not only the resurrection, but the supernatural. So they did not believe in angels. They did not believe in demons. They did not believe in the afterlife. They did not believe in miracles. They did not believe in the resurrection. They were a real bummer at parties. That's why they were sad, you see. They didn't believe in any of the fun stuff. No, I honestly, I forgot until Tom said that one. Okay, 24. So verse 24, this is a commandment that we find in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 5. This is called the Levirate marriage. Now, again, I know it's a strange custom, and we don't have this custom in America today, but understand that this was normal at the time. Also, this is a rabbit trail, but for those of you who have nothing to do this weekend, the Levirate marriage was necessary for Jesus to be Messiah. Because when you go through the family tree leading to Jesus, God cursed one fella in that line, and the Levirate marriage is the workaround where God was still able to have Jesus come from the line of David and still be Messiah. Now, we're not going to get there today, but if you run into that problem one day, maybe you'll remember this and you can look it up. So the Levirate marriage, there's significance beyond just what we're talking about right now. Okay, in verses 25 to 27, the Sadducees, they present to Jesus a hypothetical scenario. Let me just tell you, I am sick of hypothetical scenarios. If you start getting questions from someone, you're the Christian, they have the hypothetical scenarios, they're just trying to give you a hard time. That's what's going on. They give Jesus a hypothetical scenario, which means they don't really want to know the answer. They want to give you a hard time. In verse 28, they ask Jesus a question, and they want Jesus to weigh in. Now, in verse 29, Jesus tells the Sadducees that they don't know the Scriptures. That was an insult. We know that the Sadducees don't believe in the supernatural and in the power of God in many ways, but they knew the Bible. The Sadducees, the Pharisees, the scribes, they all knew the Bible. Now, what's funny is in verse 23, in the beginning of what we're talking about, The Sadducees came to Jesus and they said, hey, if a man has a wife, then he dies. It's tough to do it the other way around. And then the brother marries and he dies, and the brother marries and he dies, and yada, yada, yada. They said, then one day in the resurrection, they give him a hypothetical that they don't even believe. They don't believe in the resurrection. They don't believe in the supernatural. So in verse 30, Jesus is confronted with this question, and before we answer the obvious question that comes up, let me ask you a question. In verse 30, what does verse 30 not say? For in the resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels of God in heaven. Now this verse is oftentimes misused and misunderstood. And when we're studying angels and demonology, people are going to bring this verse up at some point. In Jesus' answer, he tells the Sadducees, you guys have a problem. You don't understand the scriptures. You don't understand the power of God. In the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels of God in heaven. What does that verse not say about angels? What does that verse not say about us? Let me ask you this. Have any of you wondered what your relationship with your spouse is going to be like in heaven? It's a popular question. If you're a preacher, you're going to get asked that question. You're right, there is no marriage in heaven. But that's really not the question people are asking. I'm not asking if I can marry some other broad in heaven, right? That's not what I'm asking. What we usually want to know is, what's my relationship going to be like with my wife? Am I still going to be married? In this case, I'm hoping I am. To her. So we're clear, and this doesn't go off the rails too fast. What the Bible does not say is that you are not married in heaven. The Bible doesn't say you are not married in heaven. It says there are no marriage ceremonies in heaven. No one is getting married in heaven. Do you understand? Do you understand that the principal reason for marriage is procreation? We get old and die and new little people have to be born and raised up. That's not happening in heaven. Okay, there's not a population crisis in heaven. Nobody in heaven dies, therefore there is no reason for procreation. As for the angels, it says that they do not procreate. They do not procreate because they do not marry. It does not say that they cannot procreate. Now, you might be wondering, Patrick, what are you talking about and why are you bringing this up? Because the Bible never explains that angels are asexual beings. It never says that. As a matter of fact, it's very much the opposite. And there's this tricky situation back in Genesis 6 that you guys know I'm fond of talking about. I'm not going to get into it right now. But there is a problem when there were fallen angels a whole long time ago and the mayhem that they created. And people often throw this verse in your face when you're going over what's called the angel theory in Genesis 6, and they're like, well, angels can't procreate. That's not what the Bible says, and it doesn't say it in this verse. As a matter of fact, we're not going to go any further. We're going to... I get into the weeds very easily, and we get off track, and then we don't get as much progress done on the chapter, so we're going to stop there. Any questions so far in what we've gone over before I get into the verses 31 and 32? Abram, what you got? Both. So the Sadducees would believe that when you die, out like a candle. That's it. There is no afterlife. They also would not believe in, say, the resurrection of Jesus. In about a week, they're going to have a real bad day. Yeah. Okay, verse 31 and 32. Jesus confronts the issue he wanted to. He doesn't answer the hypothetical question they were asking about. He quotes Exodus 3 to the Sadducees, stating that God said to Moses that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are alive, and that God is the God of the living. What that means is there is a resurrection. And that's the point that Jesus wanted to make with the Sadducees. In verse 33, again, the people are impressed with the answer, and they leave Jesus alone. Now, unfortunately, Jesus did not explain in greater detail how marriage on earth works in heaven. And most of us all have more questions about that. I can tell you what I think, but it's really not applicable to this chapter, so this is more of a post-church over a fifth piece of pie conversation. So let's read verses 34 to 40, and we'll try to get close to wrapping up this chapter. Okay, verse 34. But when the Pharisees had heard that he had put the Sadducees to silence, they were gathered together. Then one of them, which was a lawyer, asked him a question, tempting him and saying, Master, which is the great commandment in the law? Jesus said unto him, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like unto it, Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So the Pharisees, here in verse 34, were now working together with the Sadducees. They all had a singular enemy now, who, strangely enough, was Messiah. These guys are all working together to try to trip up God. Verse 35. A lawyer gets involved. How do you know if a lawyer's lying to you? His lips are moving. What do you call a bus full of lawyers going off a cliff? Good start. You know where if you know a lawyer, ask them for a couple lawyer jokes. They know them all. I don't know. Three? Question.
Did the Sadducees believe in a Messiah, like in a Messiah?
I don't know. Yeah, I really don't know if the Sadducees were expecting Messiah. The Pharisees definitely were. Yep, I'd have to look that up. Okay, the lawyer attempts to trick Jesus in verse 35. In verse 36, there are hundreds of laws in the Bible. Now, the brief explanation of laws is this simple. Because you're going to run into a friend or you're going to run into someone that struggles with the Bible and Christianity. When God says, don't do this, why does he say, don't do this? Because this is bad for you. That's why he says it. When God says doing this is a sin, it's because this thing is bad for you. When God says do this, it's because this thing is good for you. Same with you and your kids, right? You have to tell them what to do and what not to do because you know better. If you left it up to them, they would make dumb decisions, right? Okay, any of us that have had a kid for 5 minutes, you watch your nephew for 1 minute, you're like, wow. Okay. There are over 600 laws found in the Torah that the Jews lived their life by. All day, every day, there were many, many laws that they lived their life by. This fellow was asking for what one was the greatest. In verse 37, what is the answer Jesus gives? His answer comes from Deuteronomy chapter 6. What Jesus quotes, and we're going to get to this verse in a minute, What Jesus quotes is a prayer called the Shema. For over 3,000 years, the Shema has been considered the most important prayer in Judaism. It is recited every morning. It is recited during the final prayer of Yom Kippur, and traditionally, it is recited as your last words before death. That is how important this prayer is in Judaism. It is found in 3 portions of the Pentateuch. It is found in 2 spots in Deuteronomy, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 9, Deuteronomy chapter 11, verses 13 through 21, and it is found in Numbers chapter 15, verses 37 to 41. Now, those are not 3 places where the same prayer is recited. The Shema is a prayer made up of 3 portions of Scripture from those 3 places. So Jesus quotes the first portion of the prayer. So the prayer goes like this: Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. This is said every morning by everyone in Judaism. I know Jews who are atheists who can recite the Shema. This is known by everybody. From the time you are a child, this would be one of the first prayers you learn. If you can speak, you are being taught this prayer in your home, if it is a Jewish home. I want you to understand how important this prayer is, because Jesus is going to make a big point about it in this chapter and in the beginning of the next one. Deuteronomy 6:5. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might. Now, in verse 38, Jesus says this is the first and the great commandment. This is it. This is the big one. And it has always been funny to me that the first and the greatest commandment, most Christians could not find it if it wasn't for Jesus quoting it here. They probably couldn't find it in the Old Testament, is what I mean. Remember, at the time Jesus is teaching this, there is no New Testament. In verse 39, this is the second most important commandment. Anyone know where this one comes from? Here's the hint. Jesus did not make it up in Matthew. Yes? Very good. Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18. Every Christian's favorite book of the Bible. Whenever you're going through a tough time, you just snuggle up with a hot chocolate next to the fire and comfort yourself with some Leviticus. Thou shalt not avenge nor bear any grudge against the children of thy people, but thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. I am the Lord. Do you know that the Quran from cover to cover does not command you to love one thing? Never. But it has over 100 commandments for you to kill those who oppose Islam. The most important commandment for God is that we love God and we love our fellow human beings. Now, I was always impressed by how simple Christianity could be. It's not easy. I'm not saying it's easy, but it is simple. The problem is, instead of loving God, who do we love? We love ourselves. Don't call out. We love ourselves. It's exactly right. And instead of loving our neighbor, who do we love? Yeah, we love stuff. We love ourselves. That's our problem. Selfishness and self-centeredness, that we think is the root of our troubles. That means that I'm the problem. Verse 40. If all the law and the prophets hang on these two verses, then why are there hundreds of commandments? There are hundreds of commandments because everyone would make up their own way to love God. And God would hate most of them. And then people would make up their own way to love their neighbor. Any questions before we finish up the chapter? 41 to 46. While the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them, saying, What think ye of Christ? Whose son is he? They say unto him, The son of David. And he saith unto them, How then doth David in spirit call him Lord? Saying, The Lord said unto my Lord, Sit thou on my right hand till I maketh thine enemies thy footstool. If David then call him Lord, how is he his son? And no man was able to answer him a word, neither durst any man from that day forth ask him any more questions. So Jesus has another question from the Pharisees, one of the last. Verse 42, who is the father of Messiah? And their answer makes sense. We know Messiah is coming from the line of David. We've known that for a long time. But in verse 43, how is Messiah the son of David if David calls him Lord? Here's the problem that not only the Pharisees and the Sadducees were struggling with, but the disciples as well. We have the advantage of reading through the Gospels and being able to look back. They didn't know what was coming. Remember, in the last couple of weeks, Jesus has told his disciples multiple times, I am going to go to Jerusalem, I will be arrested, they will kill me, but then I will rise again. And when it happened, it was a surprise to everybody. At the time, I think they were expecting a man who would be a deliverer and a prophet. So I think when the folks thought of Messiah, they were thinking, we're going to get someone like Moses. Someone that's going to show up and he's going to be in charge and he's going to be a great prophet and a great deliverer and he's going to lead the people and he's going to have direct contact with God and it's going to be wonderful. They did not understand the concept of the God-man. They did not understand that Messiah, when he came, he was going to be 100% God. And Jesus is God. No one up here is arguing that. But he also took upon him humanity so that he could be tempted in every way we were, yet without sin. So that he could go to the cross and die for us. And in verse 46, that is what we call the final nail in the coffin. The fat lady is singing. It's over. The Pharisees and the Sadducees, they have lost and taken their beating, and they are not getting up. They are done asking Jesus questions. Next is chapter 23. Any questions before we jump in? Okay, you guys are easy. Chapter 23, let's read 5 verses. Then spake Jesus to the multitude and to his disciples, saying, The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. All therefore, whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do. But do not ye after their works, for they say and do not. For they bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. But all their works they do for to be seen of men. They make broad their phylacteries and enlarge the borders of their garments. Okay, in verse 1. Jesus speaks to the multitude and to his disciples. Now, understand that at this time, in Jerusalem, in the nation of Israel, Jesus is probably one of the most famous people in the country. His ministry has gone on for over 3 years, and everybody has heard of him. In the city of Jerusalem, people were excited to go to Jerusalem for the feast days this time because they knew Jesus would be there and he would be teaching, and everyone wanted to hear more about this guy. Whether you loved this guy or you hated this guy, everyone was showing up to hear this guy speak. And by the way, when you all showed up, he healed a bunch of you. He was a popular guy. So I believe there were massive crowds trying to get in to be able to hear him when he preached. Along with that, the richest and most influential people in the country are present. This includes the religious leaders of the country, which we know are present because Jesus is about to address them. His disciples are present, and there is also a big crowd. Now, something else to notice. This is his last public message. From this point forward, his messages are smaller and more intimate, just with his folks. Jesus starts his ministry with his first public address, which is the Sermon on the Mount, and that message was about righteousness. And in chapter 23, his last public message, and it is about false righteousness. In verse 2, there are several meanings to this verse. Number one, and let me read it again, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. What is Moses' seat? The first thing Jesus is making the point here to convey to everyone is that they, the scribes and the Pharisees, are the rightful teachers of the Torah in Israel. Now, I think that most of us would agree that they don't do a good job, but they are the authority. Jesus very soon is going to bring up a lot of their failures. But he starts by telling everyone that they are appointed by God and they are sitting in the seat of authority. Now, this is the second meaning of the seat of Moses. The seat of Moses was a real seat. Archaeologists have uncovered ruins from the 3rd century of a town called Chorazin. In the middle of a 25-acre city, there was a large synagogue constructed of black basalt. Now, in 1926, excavators found a chair carved from a single block of basalt and inscribed in Aramaic near the wall of the synagogue that faced Jerusalem. It is believed the stone chair was the so-called seat of Moses. And rabbis used this chair to read the Torah and make declarative statements. The original chair, this is not the original chair, this is a replica that they carved, and it is sitting in present-day Chorazin in the ruins. If you go to Israel, you can see this one. If you want to see the original one, you got to go to the Museum of Israel in Jerusalem. Now, the town of Chorazin was cursed by Jesus back in Matthew chapter 11, verse 21. The Chorazin synagogue featured a stone relief of the Greek goddess Medusa. You can see right here is the face of Medusa. Here it is zoomed in. They also had depictions of the sun god Helios and centaurs that adorned the synagogue. Those in Chorazin did not have faith in God, and that is why Jesus, when he preached there, nobody repented. And they were idolaters. in verse 3, Jesus continues to talk about the scribes and the Pharisees who sit in the seat of Moses. Understand, he is saying publicly, these guys are the authority. Good or bad, they're still the authority. Then he says something that upsets a lot of Christians. He says, all therefore whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do. Jesus is telling the people to listen to all that the Pharisees tell them to do and to obey it. Now, what Jesus is saying is when the Pharisees speak the law of Moses from the seat of Moses, you should do it. Now, a lot of Christians have a problem with that. And the reason they have a problem with that is because of our exegesis. Exegesis is the way that you critically examine Scripture. And most people look at the Bible broken up into two segments. We got the Old Testament and we got the New Testament. And right now, we're in the book of Matthew, we're in the New Testament, and Jesus is telling all the people that they need to obey the Pharisees when they tell them to do the law of Moses, and that's a little difficult for some people to hear. Christians today think that the New Testament begins in Matthew chapter 1. It does not. By the way, Old Testament and New Testament are not biblical terms. Additionally, our Bibles are separated into the Old Testament and the New Testament, with the dividing line being the end of the last prophet, the book of Malachi, and chapter 1 of the book of Matthew being the beginning of the New Testament. The Bible does not use the phrases Old Testament and New Testament. The Bible uses the phrase New Covenant, which appears in Jeremiah 31. That's the first place it appears. It appears 3 more times in the book of Hebrews. Now, the first covenant was back here in 1400 BC, and that's when Moses goes up Mount Sinai and gets the law of the Lord and brings it down to the people and gives them the law. This is the first covenant. The Bible actually calls it the Old Covenant. We read about that in the book of Hebrews. And the Old Covenant, which is the law of Moses, and the Torah are the first 5 books of the Bible. In the Hebrew, it's called the Torah. In the Greek, it's called the Pentateuch. Penta meaning 5. The first 5 books, or the books of Moses. So this is what the Old Covenant is. And when we read about the Tanakh being the Hebrew word for what we would call the Old Testament, it is comprised of Moses and the prophets. That's what makes what we would call the Old Testament. So the Old Covenant started right here with Moses, and it continues all the way up until the cross. It does not end with Malachi. Now, what we find is here is the ministry of Malachi, which is about 40 years. And then in 400 BC, there is this 400-year period that we call the 400 years of silence. And what that means is that Malachi, or as I like to call him, the last and only Italian prophet, Malachi, he shows up, and he is the last prophet that God sends to the nation of Israel for 400 years. The nation of Israel was used to having prophets show up and speak on behalf of God regularly, usually when they were messing up, but sometimes to tell them they were doing good. And for 400 years, there was no prophet in Israel. Then Jesus is born right here. Roughly 32 to 35 years later is the crucifixion. That is the beginning of the New Covenant. The New Covenant starts with the death of the man that brings the testament. That is told to us in Hebrews chapter 9, verses 16 and 17. A testament is not in force until the death of the testator. So Jesus, who is the one that brings the new covenant, ushers it in. It is upon his death that the new covenant starts. Well, where are we going with this, Patrick? What that means is that everything here between Matthew chapter 1 and the crucifixion is Old Testament. And so many Christians read portions in the Gospels where Jesus is talking. Do you remember in Matthew 10, 11, and 12, Jesus called the 12. He ordained the 12. He gave them special powers. And he said, go out and preach the kingdom of heaven. And who are they to go to? The lost sheep of the house of Israel. They were not to go to the Gentiles. They were not even allowed to go to the Samaritans. Jesus came with a ministry for Israel. Once they rejected him, which began in Matthew 10, 11, and 12, and then officially happened when he rode into Jerusalem on the donkey and no one was there to greet the king, and it will be finished in a court in front of Pontius Pilate when Pilate himself says, this man is innocent. What do you want me to do with this innocent man? And they scream, crucify him. And he goes and symbolically washes his hands and says, his blood will be upon your hands. And what do they say? What is their response? Let his blood be upon us and on our children. That is the rejection of Messiah by the nation of Israel. And then comes the ministry to the Gentiles. And we read about that in the parable back in Matthew chapter 21. So you have to understand that this was the end of the old covenant. Jesus riding in on the donkey, as promised, Messiah, King, who they were all waiting for, and they rejected him. But we are still in the Old Testament. That is why Jesus' entire ministry was to the Jews. And then he teaches us a parable, and he literally says, invite all the Jews to the wedding. Oh, none of them want to come? All right, go out and get whoever. You know who's included in whoever? We are. And praise God for that. He let in the rabble. Okay. Any questions on the timeline? Yeah. Wash, write that down, that we email that to everybody. Absolutely. Okay, so because the new covenant starts at the cross, it should not surprise us that Jesus obeyed the law of Moses, and he taught everyone else to do it. If a Christian believes that the new covenant starts at the birth of Christ in Matthew 1, then many of the teachings of Jesus are tricky, and they don't seem to make sense. It's because his ministry was to the Jews. First, verse 3. Now on to the second part of verse 3. Jesus says, do not do what they do, talking about the Pharisees, because they don't do what they teach. The Pharisees say the right thing, but they do not do the right thing. Do you want to know one of the fastest ways to ruin your church? Just do stuff different than what you preach. You won't get that past the people. Folks ain't okay with that. Do you want to know that's the reason that some pastors won't preach certain parts of the Bible? They don't want to preach the parts that they don't do. Because it's telling and it's difficult. Do you know that you can teach any part of the Bible, you can make a stand on any single part of the Bible, no matter how difficult it is, so long as it's in the Bible and you're doing what the Bible says. The people will put up with it. They might not like it, but you really don't have a leg to stand on if you're doing what you preach. The further away you get from your life and what you preach in the pulpit, the harder it is for people to put up with it. So the Pharisees were not living what they were teaching, and we are all about to get the details. Okay, so in verse 4, understand what's happening here. Jesus is teaching a lesson about the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the scribes while they're standing there. Any of you okay with that? Me preaching a message on Glenn and Dave while they're here? Yeah, all you are like, yeah, let's hear it, Patrick. What about Glenn and Dave? I've had it up to here with them. How would that go over? Do you understand the level of tension in this message Jesus is about to give? The Pharisees were happy to let the people do the heavy lifting when it came to the scriptures. They were not willing to lift a finger. They preached that you needed to be generous, but they won't open their wallet. They want others to help with the orphans and the widows, but they won't give of their time. In verse 5, Jesus says, all their works. All their works they do for to be seen of men. The only time they will help someone out is when you're watching. The scribes and the Pharisees literally never did anything because they loved God, and they never did anything because they loved people. Okay, in verse 5, what is Jesus talking about when he says they would enlarge their phylacteries? Okay. Stay out of my preaching. Okay, what Jesus is talking about with the phylacteries, there are two things that he's talking about. The first are called tephelin. Phylacteries is a Greek term. In the Hebrew word for these is tephelin. Does anyone know what they are? They're little boxes with leather straps and funny writing on it that we don't know how to read. That's right. They put scriptures in these boxes. The scriptures in these boxes relate to doing the commandments of God and implementing the commandments of God in their life. We read about this in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 6 through 9. And these words which I command thee this day shall be in thine heart, and thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children, and shalt talk of them when thou sittest in thine house, and when thou walkest by the way, and when thou liest down, and when thou risest up. Do you know what that portion of Scripture is called? Do you want to know the verse preceding that I didn't read? Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. They put the Shema in those boxes and wore them. They all have the Shema written in those boxes. Typically, you will only see Orthodox Jews wearing those. And they wear them at certain times when they go to typically a prayer service. They probably will not have John 3:16 in there. Yeah, there's a bunch of them that didn't make the cut. Let's continue with the scripture they have in there. And thou shalt bind them for a sign upon thine hand, and they shall be as frontlets between thine eyes, and thou shalt write them upon the posts of thy house and upon thy gates. You are to bind them for a sign upon thy hand, and wear them as frontlets between thine eyes. So, the Jews would wear these on their forehead and on their arm. They would literally make these leather boxes larger so the people would notice that they would look righteous and holy. That's what the Pharisees did. They made the box much, much bigger that they wore so that they would appear to be more holy. They wanted everyone to see that they were wearing them. The scribes and the Pharisees would also enlarge the tassels they would wear on the corners of their tallit. The tallit was a garment that all Jewish men wore, including Jesus. And on the corners of the tallit, they would wear a fringe that they called a tzitzit. So these fringes were on the corners of the tallit, on all four corners. Do you want to know what they called the corners of the tallit? They called it its wings. And in Malachi chapter 2, there's a prophecy that when Messiah shows up, he will have healing in his wings. And when a certain woman with an issue of blood of 12 years was in a crowd, she knew that if she could just get up to Jesus and touch the hem of his garment, she would be healed. The tallit, the corners of the tallit, is called the wings. On the corners of the tallit, they would wear the fringes that they call the tzitzit. We read about this in Numbers chapter 15. Numbers chapter 15 is the third portion of the Shema. Speak unto the children of Israel and bid them that they make them fringes in the borders of their garments throughout their generations, and that they put upon the fringe of the borders a riband of blue. And it shall be unto you for a fringe, that you may look upon it and remember all the commandments of the Lord, and do them, and that ye seek not after your own heart and your own eyes, after which ye use to go a-whoring, that ye may remember and do all my commandments, and be holy unto your God. The scribes and the Pharisees would make their tassels longer so people would notice them. I read that they made these long enough to drag on the ground. The tefillin and the tzitzit were commandments that God gave. There's nothing wrong with them. But the scribes and the Pharisees ignored the reason for them, and they used them as a way to feed their own pride. They wanted to be noticed of men. The tefillin that you would wear on your forearm represented effort. It represented deeds. The tefillin on your forehead represents thinking. So as we bind them on our forearm and on our forehead, we are reminded that we should do the will of God, and we should think upon the will of God and his commandments. The scribes and the Pharisees were attempting to bring glory to themselves by making sure that everyone could see their giant tefillin and their ridiculously long tzitzit. Now, I wear tzitzit. You don't really hide them. Everyone notices. And many folks have asked me what they are and why I wear them. And Numbers 15 describes why I wear them. that ye may look upon it and remember all the commandments of the Lord. So that's the goal. The goal is to help us remember who we are as Christians and who God is, and that his commandments are good. Now, I did not realize how effective. Did I say effective? It sounded in my head like I said defective. I did not realize how effective seats were at reminding you about the commandments of God throughout the day until I started wearing them. Now, they are not magical. They do not possess superpowers. But if I'm in a bar and a fight breaks out, it does give me a good idea as to who's on my side. Seriously, though, the seat are in your way constantly. All day long, no matter what you do, they are in your way. Every time you go to buckle your seatbelt, this thing's in the way. You got to move it. Anytime you're to get down on your knees, and I do plumbing, heating, and cooling, so I'm on my knees a lot, I'm in crawl spaces. These represent the Word of God and his commandments. So you don't want them on the floor, so you tuck them into your pockets. And then when you're done working on the floor, you take them back out. 100 times a day, I am reminded about the commandments of God. And my goal is that every time they're in my way, I pray. Now, it's not a long 5-minute prayer, but in 1 Thessalonians, we're told to pray without ceasing. Let me tell you, this helps. Any questions? Okay. I know we're 4 minutes past. We're going to put the hammer down and try to get through the next couple verses and just finish up verse 12. Okay. In verse 6. And love the uppermost rooms at feasts and the chief seats in the synagogues and greetings in the markets, and to be called of men, Rabbi, Rabbi. But be not ye called Rabbi, for one is your master, even Christ, and all your brethren. And call no man your father upon the earth, for one is your Father which is in heaven. Neither be ye called masters, for one is your master, even Christ. But he that is greatest among you shall be your servant, and whosoever shall exalt himself shall be abased, and he that shall humble himself shall be exalted. Okay, in verses 6 and 7, we find that the Pharisees, they liked the uppermost rooms and the chief seats at the synagogue, and they loved to be called rabbi. Let me tell you, they got into ministry for the wrong reason. They liked the perks. They like the privileges of ministry. So these guys don't show up at your house to be a blessing to you. These guys don't show up in the synagogue to be a blessing to the congregation. They want to be recognized as something special no matter where they go and no matter what they do. Keep in mind, this was a time when rabbi was a respected and honored profession. In verse 8, we should not look to be the one who receives honor. Additionally, we are told that we are all brothers. Do you know there's no such thing as rank in God's family? Ground is level at the foot of the cross. Kings and slaves. The blood of the Lamb is required for any of them to go to heaven. Verse 9. God is making the point that there is one we should all look to, and that is Messiah. We should not call anyone Father. Do you know that in the days of Jesus, and not even just in the days of Jesus, I mean, this still exists in Orthodox Jewish communities. If one family had a dispute with another family in a Jewish community, they would not take their grievance to the civil authorities. They would go to what they called Bet Din, which was the house of judgment. Bet is the Hebrew word for house. Bethlehem is the house of bread. Lechem is bread. Bethlehem, house of bread. Bet Din, house of judgment. That's your Hebrew lesson for the day. Now, there was the person who was in charge of the Bet Din, who was the father of the house of judgment. And he was the most respected and revered man in the community. And they called him Father. That's what Jesus is talking about. He's saying that the idea that you want to have this position, again, is not because you have a desire to love God with all your heart, or that you want to love your fellow man with all your heart. You are looking for this position so you can heap up honor on yourself and feed your pride. Do you know how to love someone? We need a lot of marriage counseling in this room. How about this? Is love a noun or a verb? Verb. People get it messed up because they think love is a noun. It is stupid white people romantic comedy nonsense. I'm going to fall in love and live happily once in a while. It's nonsense. That's not how it works. It's an action word. I can tell you I love you as much as I want. It means nothing unless I'm there for you. Ministry 101, serve the people. Yes, ma'am. Yep, because it's an action word. Yep. You can't feel charity, right? It's not a bumper sticker we put on a car. It's something we do. Yep, that's exactly it. Verses 10 and 11. The scribes and the Pharisees have it backwards. The leaders in the synagogues in the days of Christ wanted the praise and the fame. They wanted to be served, and they wanted the perks. Jesus taught us this idea several times. Who are in charge are the ones that must serve. Now, Jesus will demonstrate this to his disciples in chapter 26 at the Last Supper by doing what? Washing their feet. The king took on the job of the slave. That's what he did. Jesus gives the greatest church leadership and church structure lesson when he washed the feet of the disciples. That is our job. Does that sound like the Pharisees and the Sadducees we're talking about? No, it's the exact opposite. In verse 12, Jesus gives us the model for success in a church. The humble pastor, the humble rabbi, serves those in their flock. Any questions, and we're done for the night. Okay, good job, everybody. We're going to have a word of prayer, and we'll be dismissed. And then I think we're going to pass out some, awards. Glenn, would you be so kind as to close us in a word of prayer?